So here again we find this idea of something ultimately restorative, just like the Philosopher's Stone of Alchemy. And I say that those are two completely complementary and mutually reinforcing and supportive areas to study. If you read the Grail literature and then you study alchemy along with it, you'll realize that you're basically looking from two different perspectives at the same body of wisdom and knowledge.
Part 2 of Holy Grail, right? Or Cosmic Grail, or whatever it is.
I'm not telling. I'm just going to do whatever I do, and it'll be what it is. No, actually what I'll do is in order to answer that question, to tell you what I was going to talk about would take me as much time as it would to just go ahead and talk about it. So, that's my plan.
Randall?
Yes?
What we learned tonight?
Yeah, I'm just going to, I've memorized what I said 2 weeks ago, so I'm just going to repeat that verbatim. So, because I know that's what Paul was pushing for, wasn't it? If you study the Grail literature and the commentary on it and the interpretations of it, you come up with a list like this. And this is really what makes this whole symbolism of the Holy Grail so complicated and so complex, really. Of all of the symbolism, the symbols that are out there, there's probably none of them that are as complex as the Grail. And so each author sort of tackles the Grail symbol from a different angle. And when I'm talking about authors now, I'm talking about the guys back in the 1100s and 1200s who were writing about it, more so than the modern commentators. What you find is the example I referenced last time was, the Hindu story about the 5 blind men feeling the elephant, and each one of them was interpreting, the guy who was feeling the leg was describing a totally different animal than the guy who was feeling the tail, compared to the guy who was feeling the ear, compared to the guy who was feeling the tusk, compared to the guy who was feeling the trunk. And what we've got is like a group of authors that are all describing, and this is how, and I was making constant parallels to the system of alchemy, because the alchemical authors of the Renaissance used the same strategy, which is you basically sort of divvy up the responsibility for describing the different aspects of it. So like no one Grail author described the whole phenomena in totality. They took a single part of it and then described that part of it. And then it would be almost like as if, you had a group of physicists who were going to write textbooks on physics, but one of them decided, well, you write on gravity, and you write on electromagnetism, and you write on thermodynamics. And so if somebody wants to get the whole picture, you've got to take the separate sources, the author who wrote about thermodynamics and the author who wrote about gravitation and the author who wrote about electromagnetism, and you have to put it all together, basically. Another author writes about the nuclear forces, whatever the case may be. And no one author wrote the comprehensive textbook that explains the symbolism of the Grail. So that's why you have to go in, and there's, Robert de Boron, and he's talking about certain things of it, and there's Wolfram von Eschenbach, and he's talking about certain aspects of it. And then there's the anonymous author of Parlez-Vous. He wrote certain things that the other guys neglected. And it's very similar in a way to the way the 4 authors of the Synoptic Gospels dealt with it. Because if you read like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what you discover is that while there's a lot of similarities and overlaps and parallels, each one will emphasize different portions of the whole story. And so One of them, John, may talk about stuff that Mark completely neglects, and vice versa. And particularly like what I've drawn for on our Holy Grail discussion, I've drawn a lot of examples of how each one of the authors describes the crucifixion slightly differently, and each one of them emphasizes certain details which in isolation don't really carry a lot of significance, but when you take these details together, they're profoundly significant in terms of describing what actually happened. Okay? Well, the Grail is the same way. We've got all of this stuff that when you read the full body of literature and the commentaries on it, and there have been commentaries on the Grail literature ongoing from the 1200s down to now. Yes, John?
Would you define Grail for us? What is, I don't exactly know what the Grail is.
Well, okay, the Grail is all of these things that's listed here, but I'll give you the brief historical synopsis. Around the middle of the 1100s to the early 1200s, during this same period, which one of the most interesting periods of Western history, was this half century to a century, late 1100s, early 1200s, where all of this stuff was going on. You had the building of the Gothic cathedrals, which was a profound phenomena unto itself. You had Kabbalistic schools that suddenly were publicly teaching things that had been secret in Kabbalism for a long time. You had the emergence of the troubadours, which was an esoteric order designed to carry the great work that was unfolding back then involving the Templars and the Gothic builders and so forth couldn't have gone on. It couldn't have happened without a very proficient means of intercommunication amongst the various groups that were coordinating their activities essentially over France, over England, over Germany, over Spain, and that means of communication was the troubadours. Okay, so you had that going on. You had the rise of the Cathar movement in southern France, which was sort of a revitalization of the early suppressed Christian mysteries, where they were basically advocating ideas of reincarnation and basically teaching that one could have a direct relationship with the divine without the necessity of this authoritarian church as a mediator, which of course was a heresy that got them in a lot of trouble. But you had the Cathars, you had the emergence of the Templars, the Templar movement, the Knights Templar, with all of the things associated with them and what they did and all those mysteries that they were involved in. So you had within this 50-year period to 100-year period, you had all this amazing stuff going on. Well, in addition, you had this literature, this really unique literature that emerged out of that time dealing with these themes of the Holy Grail, which had to do, generally now when you talk about Holy Grail within the context of the Judeo-Christian tradition, it makes a reference to the chalice that was used at the Last Supper prior to the crucifixion when Jesus made and said, you know, this is the blood of my blood, and we drink this toast, and they did this toast around the table, and he was drinking from this chalice. Then, after the crucifixion, Joseph of Arimathea went there and collected the blood of Christ within this chalice. Okay, that's what the Bible talks about. Now you get into the legends, and there are legends, actually probably that preceded the Middle Ages appearance of the Grail literature that talks about that same Joseph of Arimathea traveling to England, carrying the chalice with him, with 12 followers, and establishing a sacred temple and precinct in the British Isles that became the first Christian church on the site where Glastonbury Abbey now is. Now this is all legendary, and there have been several scholars that have looked into that and have written papers saying that it could be that the legends are based upon historical fact. But it's so far back that you can't make a conclusive case. However, the case is circumstantial but very much supportive of the idea that the legends about Joseph of Arimathea do have their roots in historical fact. That historical fact being that Joseph of Arimathea went to England at post-crucifixion and established what would have been, at that time, the very first ever Christian church. So the Grail is this symbol that comes out in this literature, primarily associated with the cup of the crucifixion, but it also has its it has its predecessors in like old Celtic tales. The Cauldron of Bran or the Cauldron of Lugh. These are old Celtic tales that talk about this great cauldron through which, you know, there can be basically infinite nourishment provided, unlimited amounts of food and drink, and so forth. That's where the probably has its roots. Anyways, in the medieval manifestation of the Grail literature, you had stories about, we've all heard this, you know, about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and the big element of the whole Arthurian mythos is this quest for the Holy Grail that the knights set out on. And all of the knights set out on this quest. They disperse far and wide across the country to try to seek the Grail, because the Grail is the antidote to this condition that has befallen the kingdom. And the kingdom has fallen under this enchantment. That's the word that's used in a lot of the literature, fallen under this enchantment. As a result of that, it's interrupted the normal processes of nature. And the whole kingdom is falling into this wasteland. Drought, babies being stillborn, high gas prices, exactly. The whole 9 yards, the whole 9 yards. So they describe the kingdom as having degenerated into a wasteland. And, you know, crops are dying in the fields, and there's no rain, and the sun doesn't show for days at a time, and everything is hazy and dark and all of this. And the antidote for that is the Grail. So they have to go out seeking the Grail, because only the Grail can restore vitality and fertility and restore the life energy to this debilitated kingdom. But at the same time, King Arthur is debilitated. He's got some kind of lingering malady that he can't even get up out of bed. And there are many variations on the story. Like I was saying, the stories, when you get into them, are extremely complex. So King Arthur has this malady, and he can't even get up out of bed. And the only thing that's going to revive the king is if he drinks from the Grail. I mean, you saw the Indiana Jones movie, right? Did anybody see the Indiana Jones movie? Remember what happened at the end? He drinks from the Grail, and Sean Connery was brought back to life because he drank from the Grail.
Well, he poured the stuff on his wound.
Oh, that was it. That was it. So he was able to come back to life and make several more movies as a result of the Grail. So, and then, of course, everybody's seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? You've all seen that, right? Probably the most authentic telling of the Grail in modern...
Especially the holy hand grenade of Antioch.
Yes, that especially. That especially. I was thinking about the Castle of Anthrax myself, if you recall, but we won't digress to that. Well, anyways, so the Grail as a symbol still lives on. It finds its way, through popular culture, although, all you get is a glimmering of the actual meaning behind the symbol. As far as using popular culture, if you don't want to immerse yourself in the Grail literature, which can be rather disorienting at first because it's mostly written in Old English or French, or you've got French translations, so it can be a little bit of an arduous task, especially a lot of the Old English. But once you get the rhythm of it, it actually is kind of cool, and we'll look at some of that here before we leave tonight. But as far as a popular culture, the movie Excalibur by John Borman is actually a very good telling of the Arthurian mythos. And of course, when you get into the tales, there's a lot of mutually inconsistent elements to it. In some of the tales, it's Parzival that finds the Grail and comes back and restores King Arthur. In other tales, it's Galahad that finds the Grail. And in some of the tales, like with the tale with Parzival, Galahad isn't even mentioned. But then in other tales, it's Galahad who finds the Grail, and then he dies on seeing the Grail, because the sight of the Grail is so intense that he can't He can't even endure the presence of the Grail and live. But if you get into the literature, you discover that there's a lot of contradictory stuff, and that's exactly what you find when you start getting into the alchemical literature, and that's deliberate. It's deliberate because the authors of these works have concealed the mysteries. And essentially what they are doing is they've set out with the stratagem that we're not going to make this easy. The mysteries are of extreme value, and it's kind of the no pain, no gain. If you're not willing to make an arduous study of this stuff, you won't get it. And like with the alchemical literature, the one thing that every author is completely silent upon is the first step. You got to figure out the first step yourself. But the way the whole methodology is set up is that if you make that first step, the first step contains within it all of the clues and information that you need for the second step. Not the third step, only the second step within the great work. As far as the third step, that will be revealed to you within the context of the second step. And so each step that you proceed through the great work contains within itself the revelations necessary to make the next step on the journey until you've completed. Like in most of the scenarios, the alchemical work is seen as a 12-stage process. And it's, again, tied with the zodiac and astrological forces because the timing of the whole process is critical. You can't just go and undertake the operation at any old time. Even if you know what the primal materia is, which is the primal material under which the work is undertaken, and that's the thing that all of the authors are silent on. What is the fundamental stuff that you work with? It's something, they describe it as being something that's very common. It's around everywhere. In fact, it's around so ubiquitously that one wouldn't even think of it was any of value. But you have to have that material, and then you begin to process and purify and work that material through 12 stages of transformation. The final stage of that transformation, the summum bonum, as they say, of the work, is the stone, the philosopher's stone, the universal medicine, the elixir of life. And it's that has this powerful restorative and regenerative capability. But the thing of it is that when you undertake this process, you have to go each of the 12 steps. And each of the 12 steps is associated with certain forces. Because like I said, even though if you know what the primal material is, if your timing isn't right, it won't work. In fact, one of the first processes is going out, for example, when the sun stands on the cusp of Aries and Taurus, and collecting the dew that falls on the ground only at that time of year. And that's an ingredient within the recipe for this transformation of the primal material. So it's very complicated. Now, one parallel, a very close parallel to the whole alchemical process, as it turns out, is the whole process of creating nuclear fission. And in fact, the story of Fulcanelli and him going into the laboratory. I've told the story of Fulcanelli going into the laboratory of André Hellbronner in France in 1937 and basically expounding upon advanced nuclear physics beyond what anybody was supposed to even know in 1937. But basically what you have is a parallel between the process of purifying uranium and putting it in a graphite matrix within a certain geometric configuration in order to make the chain reaction possible. Well, it's the same thing in alchemy. You have to have a highly purified material. It has to be placed within some unspecified matrix, and that in turn has to be translated into a specific geometric form, and then all of that has to be governed by the temporal conditions, whatever the cosmic forces are at the time. And if you do all of that, you will have fusion. Just like with the nuclear synthesis, you will get fusion only when you get the exact arrangement of materials. So there's a very interesting parallel there. And so the story of Fulcanelli going into the laboratory in 1937 and talking to Jacques Bergier and saying, the alchemists have known for a long time. You guys are trying to use electricity and vacuum techniques to initiate the chain reaction, but the alchemists have known for a long time that certain geometrical arrangements of highly purified materials is enough to release nuclear forces without resort to these more pedestrian type of methods that you're attempting to use here. And then, of course, that's exactly what it turned out to be. Purifying uranium. You can't just take the crude uranium out of the ground. It has to be highly purified, and that's the worry about nuclear proliferation is that the purification of uranium that's then used in nuclear power plants would be suitable for bomb grade uranium. But that's getting off the track. In any case, I think that it's highly suggestive that the alchemists had access to some kind of extremely sophisticated science. And I think the alchemists of the Renaissance times were essentially the inheritors of a tradition that the authors of the Grail literature also had access to. And they represented all of that symbolism of the Grail. I mean, if you read the legends of the Grail, it's an extremely powerful technology. That's very obvious, just like the technology of the Ark of the Covenant. When you read the story about the Ark of the Covenant, you realize that that's what we're dealing with. There's some kind of a very sophisticated technology that's completely out of the historical context of the times of 3,000 years ago. But all along, we're seeing evidence that there was sophisticated technologies that didn't seem to fit in with the times or place that they were. And certainly, I think the Grail falls under that category. And so, when you read the Grail literature and you begin to really dwell and incorporate the symbolism and imagery of the Grail, this is the stuff that you come up with. And of course, the first one up there is the one that is the most generally acknowledged or recognized by most people, is the idea of a chalice or a cup. I mean, that's how it's, certainly, and that's how it was represented, in the movies and in the popularizations of it as a cup. And in the Christianized version, it was the cup. But reading authors like Michael Baigent and Henry Lincoln and those guys who wrote Holy Blood, Holy Grail and stuff, they have certainly made a very convincing argument to show that the Grail was actually a symbol for blood. And we saw 2 weeks ago how the etymology of the word sangral and sangreal are variations. On the one hand, you have sangral, which means royal blood, and on the other, it means Holy Grail. So Holy Grail and sangral are basically like Kabbalistic variations on the same formula. And it connects the idea of this cup with the blood, which again that association is being made in the story of collecting Jesus' blood on the cross. And then carrying that blood. What was the point of collecting that blood and presumably sealing it into this container, which is the Grail, and carrying it up to England? What was the point of that? Well, what we were hinting at 2 weeks ago was that there must be something unique about the blood of Christ. But when you get into, like what Jerry and I were talking about, the mufkut, which was the Egyptian word for this substance, which according to some researchers seems to have some kind of transformative effect on human blood. Yes, Elizabeth?
With the show, I interviewed the lady down in Covington who was channeling Mary, once a month for a while. And they had all these scientists come in to examine the statues that were bleeding blood out of their eyes, the Jesus statues. And they said it was definitely human blood, but it had no DNA. And so they were kind of freaking out about that because it's very unusual not to have any animal, any human, not to have DNA. But as he said, if it's the Son of God, then I guess it wouldn't be DNA.
Well, I don't know about that. That's beyond my field of expertise. But maybe in 2 weeks, I'll rectify that. Yes, Jerry?
Why is it important to draw a comparison between nuclear reactions and enlightenment?
Oh, I always look for comparisons and parallels. I think that's part of what you need to do. I mean, because nature works by analogy, and I mean a big part of the whole occult approach to knowledge is looking for analogies, and to me it's a viable analogy. I'm not saying that you have to know anything about nuclear physics in order to become enlightened. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying it's a very interesting analogy. And, you know, I mean, nuclear physics is essentially human discoveries of processes in nature that work. You know, if you arrange certain materials in a certain way, something happens. And this is what the alchemists were saying 500 years ago, and the authors of the Holy Grail were saying 800 years ago. That if you arrange certain materials in certain ways, something happens. And I'm not saying that they were trying to create atom bombs. You know, that's not what I'm implying at all. But what I'm saying is that, you know, nature works in analogies. And no matter which area you look at nature, I think there are lessons that you can see. You know, that's all it is, Jerry. It's an analogy. You don't have to get too concerned about it. Okay, so it's intimately connected with the ritual of the crucifixion. That's discussed, you know, Robert de Boron gets into that, particularly in his story. It's described in some of the literature as being a man's head, just a severed head, which could connect it with the, you know, the story of John the Baptist, perhaps. In one story, it's actually described as a man's head on a plate swimming in blood. The blood is always ever present. A quest for something hidden or something lost. In almost a generic sense, that's what it's come to imply. A quest for anything that has been lost or hidden. It's also associated with the fertility of the landscape because, again, the stories describe the kingdom, presumably we would guess England or the British Isles, falling into deterioration, decay, senescence, turning into a wasteland, and the only way to restore the wasteland to fertility is to find the Grail, which to me is to find the something hidden or something lost, which is this lost technology, which is associated with the fertility and the fecundity of the landscape. Also, particularly in Wolfram von Eschenbach, you read descriptions of it as a stone, that's the lapis exilis, the words he uses, or a stone fallen from heaven, also a sapphire stone or a green stone. And then, of course, it's associated with the knights, with King Arthur, the Round Table, and the Templars. In fact, Robert de Boron and Wolfram von Eschenbach, two of the most preeminent of the Grail authors, were Templar knights. So here's, you know, it's very possible that a lot of the Grail mythos comes out of their esoteric or secret doctrines that they were at that time revealing. Plus, another link with the idea of the blood is, of course, the Shroud of Turin. And you know, we've all heard of the Shroud of Turin, right? The Shroud of Turin was, you know, the shroud that Jesus was wrapped in when he was taken off the cross and brought to the tomb. And then afterwards, according to legend, the same with the story of St. Veronica's veil, is that afterwards an image of Christ was seen on the piece of cloth. And of course, it has been identified and proved conclusively that there is blood on that shroud. And of course, we've all seen pictures, right? The negative image of a human figure that fits all the criteria of the crucifixion. But then, you know, about 15 years ago, they radiocarbon dated it and said, well, it's a medieval forgery, end of discussion. As if calling it a medieval forgery somehow then reduces the significance or the mystery surrounding it, because who in the Middle Ages, in the 1300s, had any ability to create a painting that was a perfect negative? You know, 500 years before there was even photography. I mean, because that's what's on the cloth. The cloth isn't a positive image, it's a negative image. And people knew there was an image on it, but it was only when Secondo de Pia, I think was his name, I forget his exact name, but he was an Italian photographer, early part of the 20th century, who took photographs of he was the first modern photographer to take photographs of the shroud. When he came back to his laboratory and developed them to his darkroom and looked at the negatives, he then saw that the negative of the cloth created a perfect positive of the image. Perfect representation. So now we're left with the official explanation, which is that it's a medieval forgery, you know, from the 1300s. So some unknown artist was able to paint a perfect negative 500 years before there was photography. Well, just never mind the question of how somebody could have done that and where somebody would have gotten the know-how to do that in the 1300s. But a curious thing is the first person to historically have possession of the shroud was Geoffrey de Charnay, who was the nephew of the one of the last Grand Masters or Deputy Grand Masters of the Templars, who was burned at the stake along with Jacques de Molay. His nephew, Geoffrey de Charnay, was the first person historically who had the shroud in his possession. So the shroud has this powerful Templar connection with it. And interestingly, when the shroud was folded up, the only part of the shroud that you would see when it was folded up was the head. And it actually appeared in the image when it was folded up as a severed head. So there could be a connection there between the description of the Grail as being a severed head with the image on the Shroud of Turin. But the Shroud of Turin, to call it a medieval hoax or medieval forgery, in no way mitigates the mystery of that object or that relic. Not at all. Although, if I took you through the whole thing, when all that radiocarbon dating was going on, I was following that process very closely. And I think they pulled a fast one on us. I think that it actually does date to the 1st century AD. But we will get into, see, that's Holy Grail Part 2.
Tonight is part 2.
Well, okay, I'm sorry, that's Holy Grail Part 3. That's Holy Grail Part 3. Okay, so let's go on. The association with rejuvenation, the Holy Grail is described as being, supremely restorative, as being a type of universal medicine. So in that respect, it's exactly analogous to the Philosopher's Stone of Alchemy. And then its connection with Joseph of Arimathea, its association with angels, because in some cases it's actually being described by some of the authors as being brought to earth by angels. And finally, the Eye of Thoth. A number of authors have connected it because of the earlier associations, the pre-Christian associations with the Grail. Yes, Elizabeth?
Didn't you miss me? What about the whole movie? The chalice is Mary's uterus and all that. There's a lot of philosophies that's what that is.
Well, nothing that I have said excludes that as being a viable interpretation. The idea of the bloodline, see, it's not so much, so in some respects, Mary of Magdalene, if we accept that whole scenario, and I think that there's a strong circumstantial case for it, that she possibly bore children, then she was the vessel for carrying that blood, the holy blood. Now, but what then that gets us to, it's like to say, for some people, oh, well, it's the holy blood, end of investigation, that answers the questions. But to me, that just raises a whole host of additional questions, like, what is the holy blood? What makes the sangreal sangreal? What makes blood holy? And then we have to go back to the earlier traditions. We have to go back to answer that, or at least get some kind of clues. We have to go back to ancient Egypt. We have to go back to ancient Sumeria and the rituals that were going on there, and the idea that there was something unique about certain individuals who had, shall we say, the blood of the gods flowing in their veins. And that's an idea, that we find associated with the Greeks. We find it associated with all of the ancient traditions, just like the story of the Great Deluge is universal all over the world. So are the stories about man's early intercourse with the gods. Read the first few chapters of Genesis. There were giants in the earth in those days. And the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. That's the exact words out of the King James Bible. What the hell are they talking about? The sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them, and they were the great men of old, the men of renown. What are they talking about there? Well, yeah, but I mean, it goes much deeper than that. I mean, we're talking about what are they? See, that found its way into the third chapter or fourth chapter of Genesis is not something that's unique to the tale of Genesis. The idea of there being this, some kind of interbreeding between humans and the gods is something that we find all over the ancient world. And so the rulers, the kings and queens of old time were the people that had this lineage to the gods. That's what made them qualified to be a ruler, is because they were descended and carried within their veins this royal blood. Well, alchemy, I suspect, has within it the formula for something that can accelerate that process, that has something in it that can transform human blood. And when we get into the description of the crucifixion itself, when we go through, we peel the surface back and we get down to the underlying Kabbalistic reading of that story, we find some very interesting things. Because if we look at the molecular structure of blood, and what happens when you draw a breath of air, and I'm getting ahead of myself here now, but when you draw a breath of air, and that oxygen is loaded onto a hemoglobin molecule, and then that hemoglobin molecule takes the oxygen molecule and distributes it around throughout your circulatory system via your lungs and carries that oxygen up to your brain, that's a very, very important process that's going on there. And what we can discover is that when we begin to examine the hemoglobin molecule, for example, it's primarily composed, it's very much like a molecule of chlorophyll. But what you have in there is you have you have 4 atoms of nitrogen that form a cross, a perfect cross. And the oxygen molecule is affixed to that cross prior to being carried throughout the body and carried up to the brain. Well, if you look at the atomic structure of nitrogen that forms that cross, you discover it's 7 protons, 7 neutrons, and 7 electrons. And when you look at the structure of that oxygen molecule, the oxygen atom that's affixed to the cross of nitrogen, you discover that it's 8 protons, 8 neutrons, and 8 electrons, right? So what we have is Stavros, the cross, in its Greek spelling, is 777. Iesus, the Greek spelling of Jesus, if you work it out Kabbalistically, it's 888. And so what we have here, I believe, is a disguised numerical formula that's describing what happens when you breathe oxygen. And that oxygen molecule is affixed to the cross of nitrogen, which is 777. And the oxygen molecule is 888. And then it goes further, 666, the number of the beast. That describes the atomic structure of carbon, which is at the nucleus of every living molecule that we know of, at least in our world, probably throughout the universe. So when they talk about the beast, whose number is 666, overtly, to say, all right, here is wisdom, let him who hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, 603 They're saying anybody who wants to go into the deeper mysteries of this has to contemplate what this 666 is describing, right? It doesn't say anything about it being the devil, like modern fundamentalists want to. It just says it's the number of a man. Well, anybody who studies into the Kabbalistic system, which is the underlying mathematical level of the scriptures and the sacred writings, knows that there are many examples of these triplicities throughout the Bible. And Iesus, which was the Greek spelling of Jesus, is an example of one of those triplicate numbers, 888. I think I've shown that before in here a year or so ago. And Stavros, the cross, which is 777. This is just a hint of what I believe, that there's a whole hidden biochemistry, if you will, within this whole story. And that's not to say that there wasn't actually some historical thing, a reenactment, if you will, because that's exactly what the sacred mystery traditions were all about. The mystery plays of old. When you went into the Eleusinian mysteries and you experienced that profound revelation in there, the way that knowledge was presented to you was through a mystery drama, a mystery play. Modern Freemasonry is essentially the preservation of that ancient mystery drama. Well, those mystery dramas are all encoded, they're all symbolical, and what they do is they convey to us ancient knowledge, ancient wisdom, ancient scientific teachings. And I suggest that, the slaying of the divine king, whether you call him Odin or Osiris or Jesus Christ, it's all talking about the same thing. What happens is, though, is each cultural, social, philosophical, or religious group that comes along has to take these ancient motifs and recast them, reformulate them into a form that's more acceptable and compatible for their own times. And I think what we're seeing at the dawn of the Piscean Age 2,000 years ago, with the emergence of the Christian mysteries and the Mithraic mysteries and so on, was a recasting of these ancient scientific teachings, but in a form that was more suitable for the changing conditions of the emerging Piscean Age. And that's why there's so much fish symbolism in both of those. Now, of course, between the Mithraic mysteries and the Christian mysteries, it would happen to be Christianity rather than Mithraism that became adopted as the official religion of the Holy Roman Empire, and so became the dominant religion. And that's why today everybody, most people in America consider, well, I'm Christian. They don't consider I'm a Mithraist. Although, never mind that Mithras was born on December 25th, 3 to 4 days after the winter solstice. Never mind that he was crucified. Never mind that there are stories about his blood and the preservation of his blood. Never mind that he worked miracles involving fishes, and right on down the line. Never mind about all of that, see. Never mind also that Mithraic mysteries, with him being born on December 25th, were being observed 300 years before there would have been any historical Christ. So, I mean, there's a lot of this that once you begin to realize that modern Christianity has much, much, much deeper roots. They refer to a new dispensation as if by calling it a new dispensation, we can then dispense with everything that preceded the emergence of the historical Christ. Well, the fact of the matter is that modern Christianity has its roots deep, deep back into the ancient mystery traditions. And to understand, I think, the authentic Christianity, that's where you have to go. And that's why when you look up one of the modern definitions of the Grail that I presented 2 weeks ago, from before, I pointed out that the modern dictionaries have excised this definition. But if you go back to the dictionaries from 1960s back, you look up Holy Grail, what you'll see is that it says it's a symbol for a lost, pure form of Christianity. Now, I have not found that definition in any post-1980s dictionaries. So the technical definition of Holy Grail that you found 40 years, 50 years ago and back has been changed. And it no longer says that it is a symbol of a lost, pure form of Christianity.
So are they referring to like the Rosicrucians or the heretics, as you would call it, those that don't need a intercessory yet?
Well, yeah, and think about what you just said, the Rosicrucians. That's the rose cross, right? Well, the symbol of the rose and the symbol of the cross, these are deeply esoteric symbols. And the rose, of course, what's unique about the rose is because the rose is a cultivated plant. And that, I think, is part of the significance of the rose. Plus, it's also a symbol of blood, but it's a cultivated plant. It's a plant that's been genetically modified.
You took the 24th degree.
No, I didn't.
In the 24th degree, you are given a rose, and you contemplate on that rose.
Well, I better go and do the 24th degree, I guess.
Very interesting.
All right.
You play with that rose.
Okay. Well, I highly recommended this work right here. I don't know if it's still available. It was translated from the French. So the translation, the English translation, is a little awkward, but it still makes a very good read. Charpentier, it's primarily, like it says, the mysteries of Chartres Cathedral, but he sees the Chartres Cathedral as being an exposition of the Grail mysteries. And if you read the literature, what we describe, we often read, like he says here, tradition says that 3 tables bore the Grail. Well, in the various stories, there are tables that the Grail, somebody sees it and it's on the table. For example, at one point it's described sitting on King Arthur's round table that we've all heard of. At another point, in the Hall of the Fisher King, the Grail is born through there. Parlez-vous or Percival, he's called Parlez-vous in some of the stories, he's called Percival in some of the other stories. Percival sees the Grail being carried in on a table. So examples. So if you read the stories, there are 3 different episodes described where at some point the Grail is on a table. Charpentier seems that table is significant. And he says it appears for us in the Christian collection of romances of the Round Table, in which it is a cup that was used by Jesus at the Last Supper and by Joseph of Arimathea thereafter to collect Christ's blood during the crucifixion. We are concerned with a cup that contains the divine blood poured into it directly or transmuted. The quest of the Knights of the Round Table was for the hidden cup, legend says. The cup was kept in the castle adventurous of the Fisher King, and the word Grail itself is Celtic. Now, the Fisher King, he was a descendant of Joseph of Arimathea. Now, if you look at the historical writings about the story of King Arthur, most of the time it's set roughly around the 5th or 6th century AD, which is very interesting because there has been some new work now that has come out within the last few years, primarily the studies done by dendrochronologists. I don't know how much you're familiar with this, that have concluded that something very profound happened in England around 536 or 540 AD, right in that time span. And it involved essentially some kind of a devastation to the local environment or local economy, a local ecology. And how you know what a dendrochronologist is? Dendrochronologist is the person who studies tree rings. Well, Mike Bailey, I think, was the main guy who spearheaded this work back in the early 90s. He was looking at tree rings in Great Britain and discovered that for about 1 to 2 decades, starting somewhere between 536 and 540, all tree growth in England essentially almost came to a complete halt. And his studies based upon what the environmental ramifications of that were was that he essentially came up and was describing, and he did these studies all from enough samples over the British Isles that he could see that it was pretty much widespread. Now, subsequent to that, there have been studies done all over the world that show a similar climate signal occurring between 536 and 540 AD. Well, the dates that historians have been able to ascertain for placing the story of King Arthur places it right at 536 to 540 AD. If you read the stories and try to place it within that context, it almost seems that the knights set out on their quest around 540 AD. Well, as it turns out, there's actually a climate signal that these dendrochronologists have identified that suggests that there was some kind of a profound environmental event that happened that lasted several decades, and as a consequence, tree growth all over England essentially came to a stop. Now, subsequent to that, they've discovered that this climate signal is registered almost over the entire planet, but it seems to be manifested most profoundly in the British Isles. To what is that attributed? Does anybody have a guess? Actually, a comet. That's the main theory is now that, and that's what Mike Bailey thinks in his work, is he suggested that perhaps a comet exploded over the British Isles between 536 and 540 AD. Now, one of the things that I didn't put on my list is a very important link, which is the link with the comet, and we're going to come back to that, because the comet, I think, provides one of the most important clues to resolving the mystery of the Holy Grail. Let us go on. Oh, the castle adventurous of the Fisher King. Fisher King, what is this suggesting again? Pisces, exactly. Piscean age. Because clearly there is an astronomical or astrological connection here. The origin of the Grail, for all that, is not, for all that, certainly Celtic. It may well be very much earlier. Now, we looked at this last week, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but he does an etymology here, and he comes up with Garel, or Garel, the urn that contains the stone, or the stone urn, Gar-al, which means the stone of God. You know that in Semitic languages, El or Al means God. And Gar, G-A-R, is one of the prefixes that appended to the word El would mean stone. So Gar-el, which is one of the etymological links for Grail, means stone of God. The two etymologies are in fact very close. In the first case, we should be concerned with a vessel in which the stone becomes, in the second, with the stone itself. The symbol is unquestionably alchemical. In practice, we cannot separate the word Grail from the word cauldron. In early Celtic times, it was the cauldron of Lugh that universal medicines were cooked over a special fire. Moreover, King Gradlon's name indicated that it was a guardian of the Grail who was engulfed in his town of Is when his Christian daughter destroyed the menhirs that marked the fields. Very important clue. What are menhirs? Standing stones, right, standing stones. Now, as we're going to proceed here, you're going to see that I believe that the standing stone phenomena is directly linked with the question of the wasteland and fertility. But cauldron, interesting, referred to as a cauldron, because when we come to the Tunguska event of 1908, the great bowl-shaped depression under the epicenter of the explosion has been called, ever since then, the cauldron. The cauldron. Now, as it turns out, as the Russian studies about this event are becoming available to us, we discovered that the Russians 30 and 40 years ago discovered all kinds of unique genetic anomalies associated with this event. New species that had never been identified before. Yes, this is to me one of the most interesting and possibly important avenues of scientific research. And thanks to the thawing of the Cold War, now a lot of that, and it's just now being slowly translated into English. Some of these studies on these new species that are endemic to this, only to this area, to the cauldron. Okay.
One in the Yucatan, you know, that's half in the water and half.
Well, bear in mind, this was 100 years ago. That was 65 million. Now, what would have happened back then? We certainly know that that event was associated with the demise of the Mesozoic, which was a whole era of life in world history, and that it was associated with the inauguration of the Cenozoic, a whole new era of life history in which new species emerged. Now, our resolution of those events is not good enough to say that out of that event somehow was spawned new species. And yet, I think that would be conjecturally valid to do that. Grail is a Celtic word, but one comes across the legend of the sacred cup under other names in other places and times. Melchizedek is represented, now this is an important link, the link between Melchizedek and the Grail, represented in the north door of Chartres, known as the door of the initiates, holding a cup that he hands to Abraham and from which the stone protrudes. Under whatever name, it invariably designates a vessel whose contents are taking their part of divinity, are penetrated with it, are in the process of transmutation. One sees a very fine Christian illustration of this on the wall of the church of Saint-Loup-des-Nudes near Provence. Saint-Loup stands there holding a chalice in which an emerald brought by an angel is materializing. The symbolism could hardly be clearer. And this is the statues on Chartres. You see Melchizedek there, he's holding the Grail. And from the Grail, the stone is protruding. And he's about to hand this off to Abraham. Now, these events go back to when? The astrological connection is symbolized by the fact that Abraham is standing on the ram. So now we're going back not to the Piscean age, but to what age? No, the ram. The age of Aries, which preceded the age of Pisces and followed the age of Taurus.
And he's also holding, isn't that an incense thing? On the other, and one's in his Grail.
This,
Yeah.
yes. I believe that's what that's how I've thought that's an incense burner. Okay, so we have this interesting connection with Melchizedek here presenting the Grail to Abraham on the door of the initiates. Is somebody trying to tell us that Melchizedek passed some kind of technological secret off to Abraham as part of his initiation when he went from Abram to Abraham and inserted the He in the middle of his name? He, which stands for window. Window. That'll be significant when we get to the part on the windows of heaven. Because remember what happened during the deluge? The windows of heaven were opened. It is a question of alchemy. Alchemy, one knows, is the art and science of gathering, fixing, and concentrating the vital current that bathes the worlds and is responsible for all life. It is a concentration that adepts succeed in effecting, and which they establish on a supporting base. It is called the Philosopher's Stone. This stone works because of the concentration very powerfully and enables the adept to bring about in everything an evolution that would otherwise take long centuries, if not millennia, to unfold in nature. Notably, and this is the test, the metamorphosis of base metals into silver or gold. Now again, what the alchemical work apparently does, according to all the adepts who've written about it, is it accelerates the normal evolutionary processes of nature.
There's studies coming out now that gold can actually increase your IQ by significant 20 plus points. And we're deficient in it, we're not getting it anymore, you know, from the food that we eat. Interesting, huh?
You got some? I might want some. I'm nearly not smart enough for my own satisfaction. The vital current, now keep this in mind, this vital current, here's another word for it, the spiritus mundi. The spiritus mundi, the spirit of the world. Among alchemists, works without check on everything in which it is bringing about evolution, man included. Let it be admitted that in certain places, now this is important, in certain places, because of the concentration of the vital stream, such evolutionary action may be stepped up, the more so as man becomes receptive. And it is this result, a kind of mutation, that is sought and obtained in pilgrimage. Because the pilgrimage wasn't just a random wandering from here to there, it was a very specific exercise in going from one sacred place to another sacred place to another sacred place. And as we proceed here, we're going to see that I think that there's something very measurable and demonstrable that sets aside these places of sanctity. There's a special property of energy there. And part of the pilgrimage was going and exposing yourself to these transformative powers or properties, not just at one, but at multiple sites, because each site of sanctity can affect a different part of your total physiology.
And don't forget that as they walk from one side to the other, they're going along like the
Exactly. The straight tracks. That's coming up, Bill. It's coming up, Bill. I knew you were going to be, I was hoping you'd be here tonight for that.
It's kind of like the Egyptian initiation. You start at the temples down at the bottom of the Nile, and each temple has this.
Certainly.
It's there, and you've got to pass before you can go to the next.
That's right. Well, see, and isn't that, what I was saying, isn't that analogous to the process of alchemy? You have to get to each step, and each step contains within itself the directions that you need to traverse the next step.
But with the Egyptian, the Great Pyramid, it's like you went into your darkest, greatest fear, and then you would go into the upper, the King's Chamber, and it was all integrating everything else, whether you could do it. You know what I mean? You could do what was required. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Oh, Harry Potter. The Goblet of Fire.
Oh, I haven't seen the Harry Potter.
The test of the fire, and then as you overcome each test, then you get a clue from that as to what your next test is. So you go through fire, overcoming the dragon, taking the egg, then the next one's underwater, and then the third one is getting the goblet.
Well, that would suggest to me that the author of Harry Potter has probably studied enough into the whole mystery tradition that she's incorporated actual elements of that process.
All the Harry Potter movies have incredible information behind them.
You ought to read them.
Well, okay. Well, let's proceed on. Now he asks rhetorically, but what knowledge must they have had, these creators and builders, to achieve the realization at this stage of such instruments of action? One can easily see, now he's referring here to Chartres Cathedral specifically, one can easily see that this pile of stones so taut, according to Claudel, that you could make it ring with a fingernail, and when I was there I tested that, and it's true. I mean, it has a resonance to it, is a replica of the dolmen. Now what's the dolmen? The dolmen was when you took two menhirs, megaliths, stood them up, and put the third one on top and created a chamber. Okay. He says it's a replica of the dolmen and imitates its use of the telluric currents, another word for the spiritus mundi. Okay. And as in the dolmen, the edifice is, this is critically important, the edifice is connected with water through the well that existed originally at the level of the choir in every cathedral. Now, one of the things that we certainly saw, if you recall, when we, 6 months ago or 4 months ago, whenever it was, when I was showing you about the North American earthworks, what did we find universally, and almost virtually without exception, in every case, we find the earthworks are associated with what element? With water, yes, with water. What he has found, what Charpentier found, and has been confirmed by geologists and dowsers, coming from both angles, geomancers, is that all of these cathedrals are built over underground springs, places where springs emerge from the ground, or confluences of underground water courses.
But so are all the, like Stonehenge, and the Stonehenge is...
Precisely my point.
What are the two...
The dolmens.
It's connected dolmens in a certain...
Okay. But there is more than this to a cathedral. It lifts itself into the air, it plunges, and for this cause it is made very high in aerial currents. Rain from the sky, atmospheric storms, the great cosmic streams. It gathers, absorbs, and transmits light. Earth, water, air, and fire. What better crucible has there ever been for the finest of human alchemies? For it is certainly a question of alchemy, the transmutation not of metal, but of man. Of man, whom it is wished to lead to a higher state of humanity. But that it may be effective, the instrument must be adapted to earth, heaven, and man himself. In those obscure times, and they were that, whence could the knowledge come? Now, we've been talking here about the alchemical dictum of as it is above, so it is below, and as it is below, so it is above. And the link between those two disparate domains is man. And what we find as we begin to understand and study the ancient infrastructure from olden times is that the infrastructure was a cosmic mapping. It was a reflection of the cosmic domain translated to earth. And at this point where we stand on the surface of the earth, and as we're going to go on here, we're going to discover that as important as the astronomical component was to the layout and design of this infrastructure, so was the geological component. And so we have the world below and the world above meeting at this interface in the sacred landscape. And then we have the adept, the initiate, who knows how to utilize that technology to accelerate his or her own evolution or transformation. But not just on an individual scale, I think on a collective scale. I think that's what we're seeing here when we look at these artifacts of old. The ancient temples, the ancient dolmens, the menhirs, the standing stones, the layered mounds of earth. When we look at these astronomical structures of the Mayans and of the Anasazi, you know all the names. We've been talking about it in here for a couple of years now. When we look at that, I think what we're looking at here is the remnants of a infrastructure whose purpose was a collective initiation and acceleration. But as the secret of the Holy Grail was that the king and the land are one, and the king is the representative of all of us, just as why Jesus, who Pilate in mockery hung the sign, Jesus Nazarenos Rex Judorum, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Nazarene, King of the Jews, in mockery, because historically he probably was the rightful king of the Jews. Herod certainly was, and he was the Roman puppet king. And if you get into that whole end of it, and of that study, that the circumstantial evidence points conclusively to the fact that Jesus was probably the rightful king in the lineage of Solomon and David, and that he undoubtedly carried at least some remnant of the royal blood, or had access to some alchemical process whereby his own royal blood could be potentized and then translated into a subsequent generation. However, we find the replication of the story of the sacrifice of the divine king, the king being connected with the land, The king and the land are one. That was the secret of the Holy Grail. Parsifal came back after discovering from the castle of the Fisher King at his return to it, because the first time he sat there mute, and he was so awestruck it didn't occur to him that he had to ask a question. And he didn't ask the significant question he was supposed to ask. So he had to wander for another 10 years or so. And after great hardship, he finally returned, and then had purified himself and had proven himself worthy to now receive the secret of the Grail. He was given that secret. He took the Grail, the secret of the Grail, or the artifact itself. He went back to Camelot. He found King Arthur on his deathbed, revitalized him by giving him this drink from the Grail, and repeated to him the secret. The secret was the king and the land are one. And as King Arthur imbibed the universal medicine, the Elixir of Life, from the Grail, his powers were restored, and when the knights rode out again, they're riding out into a land that is being regenerated from the wasteland. The trees are coming back, the flowers are blooming, the grasses are growing, etc. Watch the movie, King Arthur, Excalibur. It's all in there. So, as King Arthur was restored, the land was restored. And this conceals, to me, one of the great secrets of the mystery, is that our well-being is inextricably linked up with the well-being of the land and the world of nature that we inhabit. And that there's a link between that. And it's a reciprocal link. It works both ways. So if something debilitates us, there is a consequence, an effect, a secondary effect within the world of nature. And then if there's a debilitating effect within the world of nature, it can affect us, and it sets up a cyclical event, a cyclical process of degeneration that can only be interrupted and reversed by an application of the lost technology symbolized by the Holy Grail. So let's go on. The Cathedral of Chartres stands on an eminence whose history remains in many respects mysterious. In Christian times, it was one of the most sought-after places of pilgrimage in France. But before that, the Gauls went there in crowds, and still earlier, the whole Celtic world. Pilgrims of the Christian era, those of the great pilgrimage who came from the east, went up singing psalms to do homage to Our Lady of Under the Earth, the Black Virgin in whose honor they had taken the pilgrim's staff and cape. Next, they went in procession by a passage on the north side, which leads to a crypt, to visit a grotto underneath the church where the sacred statue was to be seen. Now, here is something very interesting. There was a black Madonna within the church, in the crypt, there 3 centuries BC, when the Romans first arrived there. The Romans assumed, and they left an inscription on it, the Romans did, saying that it was Isis with the child Horus. This is not the one that was in Chartres, but there were many examples of the Black Madonna found throughout Europe until mostly like post-Middle Ages they started destroying them. I think it was a 17th century bishop that had the Black Madonna from the crypt of Chartres, which had been taken up out of the crypt, up somewhere in the nave and displayed there. He had it destroyed because he knew the legends connecting it with Isis and Horus, and he didn't want, he didn't want his parishioners or whatever to be questioning, asking questions about such things. In any case, it's interesting that here is this Black Madonna, and the Roman inscription said, Virgin with Child. Now, this was found 300 years before Christ, right? But the really interesting thing is when you read the accounts, and I believe it's Herodotus and a couple of others talking about this, the original Black Madonna was down in a grotto. And at the feet of the grotto, at the feet of the Black Madonna, was the well, the sacred well that went down deep into the bedrock. So you had the spring, the sacred well, coming up at the feet of the Madonna, and the rock under her foot that rose up out of the spring had been carved so that it appeared to become, the rock came up and had been carved so that it became the head of a serpent, and her foot was on the head of the serpent. Yeah. Now, when you realize that the serpent is a symbol of the Spiritus Mundi, you can start putting 2 and 2 together here.
And that's connected to the Kundalini, the right and the left, the man and the woman.
Sure, the Ida, the Pingala, the Sushumna, all of that, yes. And see, when we're talking about the 72,000 nadis, which are the channel ways, the conduits for the pranic force, the vital life force in humanity. Take that same idea and translate it to the earth as a whole. And the nodal points of the nadis, which is where the acupuncturists insert their needles, those are the points of sanctity. Those are the points where the confluence of the lines of force converge, and there's where they built their temples. There's where they built their cathedrals. There's where they set up the dolmens and the menhirs, and so forth. Those were the places where they would go to become revivified, to absorb that energy, the bioenergy, if you want to call it that. Yes, exactly. The ley lines, the lines connecting these centers, are like the 72,000 nadis that pervade the human physiology.
How could we map, like America, if we wanted to find these nadis?
Well, the first thing we would do is we would go to the traditional, which of course is, we've got, you know, that's why I preached for a month on all of the ancient earthworks of North America, and that's why Brad and I went out to the Southwest, principally, was to explore the ancient infrastructure out there, because this was the operational technologies that these people were implementing. And now a recreation of the exact forms and positions and so forth they used then may not be applicable to now, because again, the balance of cosmic forces has changed. Places where there were springs 1,000 years ago, some of those springs have dried up.
Doesn't the Earth spiral up, so things and things shift on the geography? So, I mean, it would change over the...
Yes, it would change, and this is why it was important. I mean, this is why there was a constant, you had to, if you didn't upkeep the system, it eventually didn't work. And I think that if we read the legends verbatim, at least some of them seem to imply that that might have been partially what happened, is that, you know, somehow the system went awry. It wasn't kept up. Just like 2 weeks ago, I used the analogy, if you don't change the oil and tune up your car regularly, you know, it's gonna fry on you. You're gonna be out on the highway driving along, and you're gonna throw a rod, and then you're gonna have a crisis. You're gonna have a catastrophe. Let's proceed beyond this. So here's the Egyptian depiction of Isis with, and of course you can, I think, see the parallels here. And that this was basically a Christianization of an earlier Egyptian myth, the myth of Isis and Horus. And Horus was the son of God, and there were many attributes of Horus that were analogous to the attributes of Christ. Note particularly her headdress. I find that to be very significant as a symbol. We won't spend any time on this. This is worth coming back to. Of course, this is The Shepherds of Arcadia by Nicholas Poussin. And as a lot of the, you know, the Da Vinci, what is it called? The Da Vinci Code, you know, this actually goes back to Holy Blood, Holy Grail. They were the first ones that popularized this. But there's some very interesting things going on here. Particularly, one assumes that the major emphasis is on what they're looking at, the inscription on the wall. But another part of it has to do with the landscape itself, because he placed the tomb here in a very specific landscape in the southern France near the Pyrenees that was of considerable importance and significance to the Cathars and the Templars. This is from the chapel at Rennes-le-Château, and this is Mary Magdalene praying, and that skull there is very interesting. Also notice there are certain things in the background which have actually been identified as being real structures. When Béranger Saunier commissioned all of these strange occult paintings to be put in this little abbey, he was attempting to codify secrets that he had gained access to. I don't know how much you know the story of Rennes-le-Château and the story of Béranger Saunier and his discovery of something in the crypt when he was going to remodel the church about 1906, I think it was. What? You thought it was what?
Just document.
Well, whatever it was, it led to him getting access to a lot of money.
And it's probably in the Vatican basement.
There's a Black Madonna in there.
I believe that's correct.
There was a Black Madonna in there?
I think there was. Okay, and here we have a pair of dragons or griffins, depending on your interpretation, who are drinking from the Grail cup. This is inscribed on the pillar, one of the pillars in Chartres Cathedral. And What are they drinking? And why griffins?
What are griffins?
You've heard Merv Griffin? Haven't you remember he was a talk show host on the...
Logical form of dragon.
Yeah.
See, it's either a dragon or a serpent on the left.
Is it like Loch Ness?
No, because they fly.
Right, see they have wings. They have wings.
Randall, is that the on the left of it? Is that the tail of the griffin, or is that a serpent?
I think that's the tail.
Tail. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Now this is from Holy Blood, Holy Grail. According to Wolfram, then, the Grail is a stone of some kind, but such a definition of the Grail is far more provocative than satisfying. Scholars have suggested a number of interpretations of the phrase, and this is what Wolfram uses, lapsit exilis, all of which are more or less plausible. And of course, to an occultist, all of these explanations bear on the ultimate definition. Lapsit exilis might be a corruption of lapis excaelis, which means a stone from the heavens, or of lapis lapsus excaelis, a stone fallen from the heaven, or finally lapis elixir, the fabulous philosopher's stone of alchemy. The whole of Wolfram's poem is laden with alchemical symbolism. The phoenix, for example, is established alchemical shorthand for resurrection or rebirth, and also in medieval iconography is an emblem of the dying and resurrected Jesus. So you'll notice again, what you have when you immerse yourself in this is this constant juxtaposition of symbols. And it's in this process that you penetrate the outer meanings to the inner meaning. Now here you see the links. You have stone from heaven. One play on word, one variation of meaning means a stone fallen from heaven, but on another variation of meaning, it's the universal, the philosopher's stone, the lapis elixir. Well, which is it? Well, it's both. And in order to understand the lapis elixir, you have to understand the lapis exilis. And what is the connection with the stone, the literal stone that has fallen from heaven?
That's right.
Well, and then they go on to say that if the phoenix is indeed somehow representative of Jesus, Wolfram is implicitly associating him with a stone. Such an association is, of course, hardly unique. There is Peter, which is Pierre, which means stone in French, the stone or rock on which Jesus establishes his church. And as we discover, Jesus in the New Testament explicitly equates himself with the keystone neglected by the builders, the keystone of the temple, the rock of Sion. And I showed you a graphic which is coming up. Okay, the lost science of antiquity. Let me back up two things here. Keystone, I showed you a graphic from masonry showing the arch with the keystone dislodged, right? Well, what completes it is the insertion of the keystone. That completes the arch. The structural integrity of that system is only completed when the keystone is inserted. Without the keystone, the whole edifice collapses. You understand that? That's why you have to grasp the significance of the keystone. It's the final act of placing the keystone in place, and it's also the thing that holds the whole arch in place, without which, boom, it all comes crashing down. And in fact, when they built Gothic cathedrals, the master builder, when they removed the formwork from under the ogi, from under the vault, they placed the keystone. After they placed the keystone, they removed the formwork. But as they removed the formwork, the master builder would have to stand under the arch. So you made damn sure that it was structurally sound, because if it wasn't, that was the end of the master builder. And I think that would be a good thing to start doing more of these days. Holding people responsible for what they do.
Start with the White House.
You start from the top and you work down from there. Yeah, you start with the White House and then you move on to Congress. Of course, if it was up to me, by the time I got through talking about, well, here's Fulcanelli quoted in Morning of the Magicians. I shall not attempt to prove to you what I am now going to say, but I ask you to repeat it to him, Hellbronner. Certain geometrical arrangements of highly purified materials are enough to release atomic forces without having recourse to either electricity or vacuum techniques. very interesting story here about, and I repeated it 2 weeks ago, and I'm not going to repeat it again, Elizabeth, sorry. Okay, many names for the cosmic life force. Prana is the name we find in yoga and Hinduism. It's described extensively in the Upanishads, if you're interested. Chi in Buddhism, Ki in Taoism. In the Greek mystery tradition, it was known as Pneuma. In the Hebrew sacred traditions, it was known as the Ruach. In Polynesian, it was Mana. Karl von Reichenbach called it the Odic force. Wilhelm Reich called it the orgone energy. It's been referred to as bioenergy. I could add telluric energy. I could add spiritus mundi. I could probably come up with another 10 names for it. It's got many names. It's the same thing, the principle. Okay, 5 variations on prana. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this, although it's very interesting. And also, I mean, it definitely helps to clarify our understanding of these traditions. The prana is associated with the breath and the heartbeat and upward motion. The apana is with the purification and elimination. It's downward motion, the udana, associated with sound, vibration, voice, song, etc. Now, again, prana means breath and air, right? So when you speak or sing, you know, you've got the interaction now between the breath and the vocal apparatus. The samana is associated with metabolism, digestion, and processing in general. The vayana is expansion and contraction, biological pulsation, voluntary muscular system. So these are various manifestations of the prana, the life force. Well, this was out of the Upanishads primarily. Okay. 3 primary channels or circuits of prana flow. The ida is the left. It culminates at the left nostril. So when you're taught yogic breathing, you do various. That's to activate the right and left sides, the ida and the pingala. There's the right channel. The sushumna is the central channel, which corresponds with the spine and with the world's axis. Very critical connection there. 72,000 nadis are channels of life force. And this, of course, is the traditional depiction of the sushumna with the ida and the pingala. The ida is the white one going up. The pingala is the red one going up. The sushumna is the central one along which the 7 chakras are aligned. And through the processes of yogic breathing and doing the asanas and meditation, the idea is you learn how to concentrate the vital force of the traveling over the 72,000 nadis, concentrated at the base of the spine in the Muladhara chakra, and then from there it rises up the spine, vivifying and awakening each of the 7 chakras, each which has its own sound and its own geometry, its own color, until finally at the culmination you reach the 1,000-petaled lotus. That's the schemata there. Now, all of this essentially translates analogously to the body of the planet itself. To understand, and the reason I bring this in is because I believe it helps us to understand the science behind this lost ancient infrastructure whose remnants are found all over the globe. We've discussed Gardner. I'm going to jump by this, other than the fact that he's talking about iridium crystal, which of course we've talked about this already, but to bring it back and connect it, iridium is brought to Earth by meteorites. It's an extraterrestrial metal. And he says that the ancients had a name for it, sapphire or sapper. This was the shathia, the stone of heaven, said to have been present beneath the Jerusalem temple, as identified in the old tenets of Royal Arch Freemasonry. Now, the Royal Arch refers us to that arch with the keystone. That the culmination of the great work is the emplacing of that keystone, because not until the keystone is placed does the arc become activated. That's when you inserting the keystone is what essentially closes the circuit and allows the circuit flow to begin. Iridium, interestingly, appears as a green stone, a green glass when you look at it under a microstone. Moldavite is a green glass that is a byproduct of a great impact event that occurred. Now, one of the things we haven't gotten into yet in here is the work of Herbert Shaw, which is very significant. He's basically trained in chaotic dynamics, and about 10 years ago he wrote a book after analyzing the geographical location of all known impacts. He wrote a whole book derived from theories of chaotic dynamics in which he concluded that the the geographic distribution of impact sites was non-random. Very important, non-random. Now, we've talked enough in here about the whole process of cosmic impacts to know that I've been suggesting and leading up to the conclusion that the distribution in time of impacts is non-random. But now his work suggests that the distribution in space is non-random. That there are certain places on the planet that are susceptible, in fact, perhaps even marked ahead of time, for delivery of cosmic materials, cosmic payloads. And that brings us very much into, I think, another element of this lost technology.
What's the name of that book?
Which book?
Herbert Shaw's book.
Let's see, Craters, Chaos and Chronicles, I think. Chaos, Craters, I think that's it. Chaos, Craters, and Chronicles. Or maybe it's Craters, Chronicles, and Chaos. Or maybe it's Chaos, Chronicles, and Craters.
I've got a layout of all those. It's very interesting on the concentrations. And I'm going to be bringing that up in a couple of weeks.
Good. Yeah, well, now we got into the etymology of the word Grail in more detail 2 weeks ago, but I think it would be beneficial to jump back to that for just a second. Because as a Kabbalist, as a student of Kabbalah, I believe that oftentimes some of the deepest secrets are hidden in the actual words or language that is used, the names that are given to things. Remember how important it was in the Bible. Jehovah actually came down and gave Adam one of his first assignments was to name everything, right? Well, the Grail. You know, this is look at here. American College Dictionary, 1967 edition. Here's what it says. The Grail. It's a noun, means a cup, also taken as a chalice, which, according to medieval legend, was used by Jesus at the Last Supper, and in which Joseph of Arimathea received the last drops of Jesus' blood at the cross. Used often as a symbol for a lost, pure kind of Christianity. Now, we get to the etymology. ME means Middle English, and it comes from Grail, spelled Grayle. That's taken from the Old French. A modification, M there means modification of Grail with a double A, taken from the Middle Latin, a modification of the stem of gradale, which means a plate. And that is derived in term from the Latin for crater, the word crater. And there, I think, is a Kabbalistic clue of incredible importance, because our word today to describe the zones of impact where cosmic materials are delivered to Earth, the word we use to describe those is craters. And they look like giant bowls, don't they, when we look at a picture of them or see one in person, just as, you know, certainly you've seen Meteor Crater, right? Yep. It's a bowl. It's a bowl. It's a big old bowl. It's a cup. You know, it's a cup. And what is in that cup? Well, what transpired in that cup? Well, what transpired in that cup was the cosmic alchemy. The delivery of these extraterrestrial exotic metals to Earth. There was the crucible in which the cosmic metals, the cosmic exotic metals like iridium and platinum and zirconium are mixed with the terrestrial. And what else happens during the force of the impact? Here's the injection of the cosmic materials into the skin of the Earth, into the surface of the Earth. But when it does that, it also creates the pathways. The shock of an object from space arriving and injecting itself in the lithosphere causes fracturing, radial fracturing that can extend out for hundreds of miles from the epicenter. Now, you inject deep into the surface of the Earth this cosmic mix of terrestrial and extraterrestrial materials. Now, you also create the lines, the pathways along which the groundwater can now begin to migrate and carry this exotic alchemical brew throughout the lithosphere. Now, over these sites where the fault lines cross, curiously, is where the sacred sites, the ancient sites, have been constructed. This can't be coincidence. And we see there, we see the Grail, the cup, the hand reaching from the sky, holding the Grail. We see the drops falling to earth. What are these drops? Well, and we see the dove descending, holding the wafer. On the wafer is the cross. We see the M, because the M is upside down, so it's not quite so readily apparent what it is. And there again we see in Rennes-le-Château, we see the Grail with the wafer and the cross. John Michel said in the book 12 Tried Nations and the Science of Enchanting the Landscape, the legend of the Grail is the Celtic version with particular application to Britain of a universal theme concerning something which has vanished and must be found or invoked again for the redemption of life on earth.
He also says there's 7 rays coming off, you know, that the little pyramid above it has 7 rays as well.
Let's go on here. Yeah, here's a listing. If anybody would like this list, I'd be glad to copy it and give it to you. These 2 pages are the major sources from the Grail literature that came out during that Middle Ages. There's 10 of them listed. Let's go on here. Okay, now here is a quote directly from Wolfram. It is well known to me that many brave knights dwell with the Grail at Mont Sauvage, which means Mount of Salvation. Always when they ride out, as they often do, it is to seek adventure. They do so for their sins, these Templars, whether their reward be defeat or victory. A valiant host lives there, and I will tell you how they are sustained. They live from a stone of the purest essence. It is called lapis exilis. By the power of this stone, the phoenix is burned to ashes, but from the ashes she is reborn. Thus does the phoenix molt and change her plumage, which afterward is bright and shining and lovely as before. This stone confers such powers on mortal men so that their flesh and bones are made young again. The stone is called the Grail and is unknown save to those who are singled out by name to join the company of the Mont Sauvage. So here again we find this idea of something ultimately restorative, just like the Philosopher's Stone of Alchemy. And I say that those are 2 completely complementary and mutually reinforcing and supportive areas to study. If you read the Grail literature and then you study alchemy along with it, you'll realize that you're basically looking from 2 different perspectives at the same body of wisdom and knowledge. Now, from Old Testament and New Stone, the stone which the builders refused has become the headstone of the corner. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. Have ye not read this scripture? The stone which the builders rejected is become the head of the corner. I want you guys to ponder this for the next 2 weeks, to ponder this idea of the stone which the builders rejected. Then now, knowing what we know, we read a passage in Ezekiel like this, and above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne as the appearance of a sapphire stone. So now we see a reference to a sapphire stone, a green stone. Let's go on here. We read that. We saw that, the ladder to heaven. Sorry, Elizabeth. We've got to move on. We'll stop for a second here. In the story of Jacob's ladder, set upon the ground in a sacred place, symbolizes another concept we have seen, the notion that there are special places. This author refers to it as the far world, where the far world and the terrestrial world are linked, places that serve as the perfect conduit between the 2 worlds. Now, there is a technological basis to this, and I'm going to show you what I believe it is. We'll review stuff that we've talked about number of months ago. How much time we have left, Sam?
Half hour.
Okay. then let me jump ahead here to this. We were talking about windows earlier, when the windows of heaven were opened. Space-time transients and unusual events. Very important work, highly recommend it. Now let's see what these two scientists were writing about and researching back in the late 70s. The authors contend that the existence of man upon a thin shell beneath which mammoth forces constantly operate cannot be overemphasized, nor is it exaggerated in perspective. Beneath the 2 times 8 to the 10th square miles of surface life activities, geophysical forces continue to interact and induce changes upon that surface. Shifts in the crust are felt as earthquakes. Distortions in distributions of mass or metals result in large-scale magnetic and gravity anomalies. These are obvious, the blatant and the easily measurable productions. Probabilistically, there should be smaller areas, perhaps not more than a few feet in radius, in which these subsurface forces are manifested. In areas, and I've got this underlined here, in areas where the constructions and compositions are more optimal relative to the adjoining spaces, the forces could be significantly different or magnified. You see what that's implying? In areas where the constructions and compositions are more optimal relative to the adjoining spaces, forces could be significantly different or magnified. Recent developments in seismology have opened many avenues for understanding pre-seismic events. Perhaps the most outstanding idea has been pursued and elaborated by Finkelstein and Powell. These scientists have suggested that during the strain of seismic pressure, forces pushing on rock crystals in large areas produce electric fields through a modification of the piezoelectric effect. These pre-fracture electric fields can reach values of several thousand volts per meter, intensities capable of ionizing the local area into visible luminosities. Indeed, one of the more constant contiguities of unusual events has been between earthquakes and luminous airy displays. The extent of these fields may by no means be small. Consider the large subsurface regions, perhaps hundreds of square miles in extent, with near-fracturing forces pushing upon them. The resulting electric and magnetic fields produced could involve large volumes of space, reaching high into the ionosphere. About 1 hour before the Hilo Hawaii quake of April 26, 1973, radio transmission ceased due to the apparent disappearance of the ionosphere. What extraordinary electric forces must have been generated before that fracture? Such forces may accumulate for weeks or perhaps even months, and may be expressed in qualitatively different fashion, since the quantal sums of energy required for a fracture would not have been reached. Because the electrical field produced by the accumulating strain is not sufficiently intense to permeate large areas of surface space, it is concentrated into the most susceptible localized area. The net result is an electrical column. Now, during the pre-fracture sequence, or alternatively, as long as the particular stress is maintained, a number of interesting possibilities could take place. First, due to high electric field in the localized area, low-level ionization of the air within and adjacent to the column could occur. This is how they depict their hypothetical electric field column produced by accumulating tectonic stress in subsurface regions. I find it interesting that they show a building there, because remember the idea that certain structures may act to magnify certain forces. Now, when you also consider the possibility, no, the probability that tectonic stresses are accumulating within the Earth as the Earth's response to changing cosmic forces and cosmic geometries, will have, I think, the basis for understanding at least part of the science and why it was so important to the ancient shamans and the ancient technicians to understand the movements of the heavens. Because the movements of the heavens were inducing forces within the Earth's crust. the passage of the moon, the relation of the moon and the sun, particularly, for example, during eclipses. Something very interesting happens during eclipses, particularly solar eclipses, when the normal oscillatory frequency of the sun's energy, the input of the sun's energy, is completely interrupted for a short period of time over a fairly large space. In fact, if you go and you begin to look at some of the great volcanic events of the last couple of centuries, you'll find that a couple of years before the Mount St. Helens eruption, there was a total solar eclipse whose cone of totality passed right over the Cascades region of Washington. If you go to Krakatoa and look at that, you'll see that a few years before the Great Krakatoa event of 1882, there was a total solar eclipse. The cone of totality passed right over Sumatra. These examples could be multiplied. And what we're seeing here, very plausibly, is that we're seeing a tectonic response to changing cosmic forces.
Now, would metal buildings be more likely to support the energy or be more influential versus brick or stucco?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. But perhaps. I mean, what I'm showing here is not a mature science where all the questions are answered. Basically, what we're seeing here is we're standing at the periphery of this vast unknown. And all we can do right now, the most important thing I think we can do right now, is just know how to ask the right questions. The geometry, right. Exactly. Well, he said that he was pointing out from the previous slide where it was talking about the shape of an area, or the shape of something. It is important to realize that the electrical field column hypothesized is not refrained from movement. So what they're saying is that this is not necessarily locked into one place and one place only, that it can actually move along a fault line. In fact, its spatial dependency would be primarily determined by the subsurface forces producing it. If the subsurface stress is moving along the fault line or rift, the concomitant surface manifestation would also move in a similar manner. The actual shape or physical dimensions or height above the ground would depend wholly upon these forces and their interactions with the characteristic electrical properties of local structures, including large buildings. I've got that underlined because I believe that that's pointing us in the direction that we need to look to understand what the ancients were doing with their sacred structures. Let us proceed on. We'll skip some of this. The existence of electrical columns produced by accumulating tectonic stress would affect living electrical systems as well. Get this? Living electrical systems. Recent experiments indicate that animals may be sensitive detectors of electric, magnetic, and infrasonic fields. Science is still not clear how animals detect ambient fields, but some species seem to use them for migration and perhaps even communication. We've all heard stories about how animals flee prior to a great earthquake or volcanic eruption. I mean, in fact, animals were fleeing one of the reports from the Indonesian tsunami.
The elephants.
Yeah.
The elephants fled up to higher ground.
Right, and not just elephants, other animals as well. We're seen fleeing. Something was disturbing these animals. Now, there's been some very interesting work suggesting that perhaps there are certain lines of force within Earth's magnetic field along which animals migrate, migrating waterfowl. And that could follow right along with the idea that it might be that migrating waterfowl are essentially responding to changes that are set up by alterations in the Earth's crust. In other words, they might be migrating along fault lines because those fault lines are setting up pathways of energy. Perhaps the most complex bioelectrical system of all is man. Within a small three-dimensional locus called a body, unfathomable ensembles of electromagnetic circuits exist. These circuits are correlated with experiences of consciousness, memory, perception, and all the various properties labeled human. Typically, human bioelectrical field patterns are displayed in a systematic manner, and consciousness and thought flow in a perceived orderly manner. But even this system is not infallible. Experiments by Leduc and more recently by others indicate that small currents induced across the scalp can produce dreamy-like states, episodes of paralysis, or intervals of unconsciousness. Certain combinations of electric current polarities and intensities seem to influence the DC battery or steady-state potentials of the brain. Ironically, one of the most electrically unstable parts of the human brain is the hippocampus, an important component of the emotion and memory circuit. If this system is stimulated even in the waking state, the person is inundated by stored images, real or unreal, that he or she cannot control. The stimulating currents are not very large in magnitude and could quite possibly be induced by transient electrical fields allegedly produced by substructure geological stress. The implications of this supposition are immense in scope, as indeed they are. Well, this is important. The actual measurement of magnetic variation anomalies is recent, and despite complex and dense networks of magnetometers, only a few of the larger and grosser events have been recorded. Usually, the intensity of the anomaly is only about twice that of the normal steady-state magnetic field condition. Although such amplification may appear quite small, it must be remembered that the anomaly is spread over large areas. Consequently, the total energy within this transient system may be quite immense. If some form of short-term focusing of the induced currents took place, then relatively large amounts of energy would be available in a small area. Here, I think, is another implication for understanding the ancient technologies. Somehow the ability to concentrate these kinds of forces into small areas. Man's consciousness and experience are totally dependent upon the complex series of electrochemical events in the brain. Normally, they are systematically and orderly related to the events in our environment. At times, transient changes in that environment can induce large modifications in these bioelectrical occurrences and change the course of thought. Now, of course, we all know, some of us at least know from experimentation, that certain substances can do also the exact same thing, that were imbibed by, typically by shamans for millennium.
Baby boomers?
What? And perhaps some baby boomers. We're going to jump on here. Here, in modern times, the work of Wilhelm Reich, I think, sheds tremendous light upon this understanding this ancient science. How many of you have heard of Wilhelm Reich? Most of you, Wilhelm Reich, yes. A letter signed by 17 medical doctors in 1949 said, "We consider the discovery of the orgone energy among the greatest events in human history." Now, this is very interesting. This was in 1949. Now, what he was calling orgone energy, we've seen fits all the criteria for the prana, the spiritus mundi, the pneuma, the ruach. What Wilhelm Reich was simply rediscovering was the life energy that ancients had known about and were able to utilize technologically for millennia, and which by modern times had become mostly forgotten. We've been through this part of it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. He was born in 1897. He was in World War I. He 24, he becomes the director of the Vienna Seminar for Psychoanalytic Therapy. 1922, he became a clinical assistant in Freud's psychoanalytic clinic in Vienna. He came to the conclusion from his studies that there was most illness was psychosomatic, and it was based upon blockages and inhibitions in the free flow of bioenergy, what he called the orgone energy. So all of the treatment modalities that he subsequently developed from that point on were designed to free the inhibitions, to remove the inhibitions to the free flow of the bioenergy within the human organism. Okay, so 1930 he moved from Vienna to Berlin. In 1933, the Nazis attempt to imprison Reich for his writings and lectures on the psychological basis of fascism. He saw that fascism was an outgrowth of what he called character armoring, which was the suppression of the life force within the human organism. From 1934 through 1936, under pressure from the Nazis, Denmark expels Reich. He relocates to Oslo, Norway, conducts studies and experiments involving changing bioelectric potentials in living organisms in response to changing stimuli. So that work would have dovetailed exactly with the stuff we were just talking about here, with changing electromagnetic fields. In 1939, he discovers the life energy as an outgrowth of his Oslo work. He names it orgone. He accepts an associate professorship at the New School for Social Research in New York. In 1940, he invents the orgone accumulator, which, again, very important for understanding the ancient technologies. 1942, he purchases a 280-acre farm near Rangeley, Maine. In 1946, the publication of the Mass Psychology of Fascism in English, relocates his permanent research to his farm in Rangeley, where he constructs a laboratory and establishes an institute he calls Organon. 1947, the medical establishment begins a campaign to discredit Reich and his work. The FDA becomes involved and begins spying on him. Now, I will mention that this was spearheaded by a man named Morris Fishbein. I think it was Morris Fishbein. Fishbein, thank you. I think I prefer to call him Fishbein.
They have a head of the AM in 1939.
Yeah, so it was Morris Fishbein. And back then, you know, is when the collusion was beginning to occur between the government and the medical establishment, and they were deciding what treatment modalities were acceptable, what weren't. You know, highly invasive procedures were acceptable, low-tech procedures involving bioenergy, et cetera, were not acceptable because it didn't earn lots of profits for the chemical industry or the nuclear industry, which of course at that time didn't really exist but was coming into existence. There's a whole book I would recommend you reading called When Healing Becomes a Crime, primarily dealing with the work of who?
Huxley.
Yeah, Huxley. And his well, see,
I've got a video on him.
yeah, that would be good to see. Okay. Hoxley. And you know, whenever people, particularly on the far liberal left, start saying, we need universal health care, and I say, why in the world would you want the government to provide your health care when the whole health care problem in this country was created 100% by the government? And its suppression of any kind of alternative, that's a whole other discussion, and I don't even want to get into that. But well, personally, I don't want the government to have anything at all to do with my health care. Okay, so in 1950, he performed the Oraner experiment. Now, the Oraner experiment was where he put a small amount of radioactive isotope, radium, I believe, into an orgone accumulator. And reading the account of what happened was quite interesting. It had a devastating effect on the local environment. And if you read the accounts of the Wasteland in the Grail stories, then you read the accounts of the Oraner experiment, you can't help but see the parallels. Because all of the things that they describe in the Grail literature is what happened in the 200 square mile area around his laboratory subsequent to this Oraner experiment. What? Well, I mean, it didn't affect him that much, but there were workers there who had to leave. I mean, the whole story is almost unbelievable. But yeah, they had to abandon certain buildings and so forth because somehow the radioactivity seemed to somehow transmute what would normally be the beneficial life energy into its opposite. Yeah. Okay, so in order to counteract the effects of that, out of desperation, he created the thing called the Cloudbuster, okay, which was, yes, and there sits one right there, right behind Dennis. And I think that may have something to do with why as soon as Dennis sits down there, he immediately goes deep into a trance state. I think. Oh, that's what it is. The hypnotic. Okay, well, I will try to talk less hypnotic then. Okay. So 1952, gosh, I was 1 year old then, invents the Cloudbuster. And I had no idea back when I was laying in the crib at 1 year old that Wilhelm Reich was inventing the Cloudbuster. He begins a series of weather modification experiments. In 1954, he witnesses UFOs in the vicinity of his farm, realizes a connection between UFO phenomena and orgone energy principles, which opens up a whole other avenue of very interesting and important research. And he's brought to trial on various charges, including accusation of fraud. Now, before we go on, let me say this. He had over 200 cancer patients that he was treating using his bioenergetic methods, using the orgone accumulator and so forth. The FDA wanted to charge him with fraud. So they went around and they started going to all of his patients that were using the orgone accumulators to solicit one of them to sign on as a complainant against Reich in this fraud lawsuit that they were trying to get him on. Well, what they constantly kept hearing from these people is, wait a second, I would be dead now if it wasn't for his treatment, and you want me to... So out of over 200 patients, they couldn't find anybody who would agree to be a plaintiff. So they dropped the idea of getting him on fraud, and they wrote him a letter demanding that he cease and desist his work. He wrote a letter back saying that a court of law was not the proper place to decide the validity of a scientific work, and that he wanted the work to be tested by his peers and so on. Because of that letter, he was then charged with contempt of court. Talk about trumped up charges. So on the basis of the contempt of court, he was put in prison. Federal prison, let's see. Reich is sentenced to 2 years in prison for contempt of court. All of Reich's equipment in his laboratory are destroyed under the supervision of the Food and Drug Administration. All of his research papers, writings, test results, and literature are loaded into a large truck, taken to an incinerator, and burned. In 1957, he died in Danbury Federal Penitentiary, Connecticut. 2 weeks before his death, his son Peter, who subsequently grew up and in the 1970s wrote a book called The Book of Dreams, describes his last visit with his father. He goes into the cell. This is about 2 weeks, I think, very close to the time he's supposed to be released, and Wilhelm Reich tells his son Peter at that time that they won't let him out alive, that he knows that he will not get out of prison alive. The day before he is to be released, he's found dead in his cell with no explanation as to the cause of death. Now, you can say, well, conspiracy nuts or whatever, or otherwise you've got a coincidence that's, pretty amazing. But in any case, Wilhelm Reich's work was suppressed in this land of the free and the home of the brave by our own government. When we go forward and we see what he was doing with his weather modification and his healing, I believe that what they have done by the suppression of his work has cost our economy of this country amounts that only could be measured in the trillions of dollars. Into trillions of dollars.
But they could have taken the antithesis of it and used it in America. When you say you take the opposite of...
Well, I think that, at the time, they pretty much dismissed it.
No, I disagree, because they wouldn't have killed him if they dismissed him.
During 1950, now this was written by a student. This book, David Bodella, he was a student of Wilhelm Reich's. He wrote a book, one of the better books on Reich's, more balanced treatments of Reich. During 1950, Reich wrote a book, Cosmic Superimposition, which was highly speculative. He advanced a number of assumptions about the derivation of certain natural processes for the tendency of streams of orgone energy to fuse, superimpose, and lead to the formation of mass particles. He believed that the spiral patterns found in such large-scale events as hurricanes and formation of galaxies were consistent with his cosmic theory. In the explanation of some events that are at the boundaries of scientific knowledge, all theories become speculative. Reich's assumption at this time was that space was filled with a primordial energy that was the source from which all forms of matter derived. The cosmic energy perceived outside the organism was identical with the biological life energy inside one's own organism. The feeling of unity between man and nature that characterized the aesthetic experience of many artists, mystics, and people in a heightened form of consciousness corresponds to an awareness of this basic identity of energy within the organism and energy without. It gave rise to the well-known oceanic feelings that are experienced in states of religious ecstasy or at times when one is strongly in love or deeply moved by some natural event.
Start to bring it to a close.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. He goes into descriptions of what the orgone energy looked like, what it felt like. This has been put forward by some Reichian researchers as perhaps being an orgone energy field around an astronaut walking on the moon.
Do you know which astronaut it is?
No, I don't. I don't remember. I think it's, yeah, and I don't remember, but it's, you can find out. Now, as he says here, a universal ubiquitous energy may be supposed to behave and to act according to its own inherent laws. In some cases, and further future knowledge may multiply them, the orgone energy can be directed and used for special purposes. The first application of orgone energy came with the construction of the orgone accumulator in its various forms. The accumulators are constructed to concentrate and irradiate orgone with the object of stimulating the natural functioning. A third application of the orgone energy is the cloud buster. I have already described how this can influence weather. If this apparatus could be more studied and used, in my opinion, it might be the greatest importance of all orgone devices. In the late 1940s, Reich began a series of tests to demonstrate this energy scientifically. The first of these was focused on the production of heat inside the orgone box. Originally, he built small orgone accumulators about 1 foot square. Now get this, made of alternating layers of metal and cellulose or other organic materials. For control, he would construct a box of the same size but made simply of wood. A finely graded thermometer placed just above the box within an enclosure or inside the box through a hole recorded higher temperatures for the orgone box than the control box. Now, very critical here, because we've talked repeatedly about the structure of these ancient, the architecture of these ancient structures. For example, what is characteristic of all the earth mounds we find in North America? Layered, of alternating materials, of predominantly organic and inorganic. Now, without having any knowledge of the structure of the great earthworks up in the Mississippi and Ohio Valley, Reich built this thing that was alternating layers of organic and inorganic material and discovered that somehow it concentrated this universal energy.
Then a meteor impact will lay down a layer of organic material of carbon.
Sure. Observed throughout the day, it was noticed that this temperature difference was small at sunrise, perhaps 0.2 degrees centigrade, and would rise to around 1 or 1.5 centigrade by 2 or 3 p.m. When the sun's heat was maximal and then declined by evening to a fraction of 1 degree. Now notice this, if the boxes were inserted into the earth, the temperature difference rose from 5 to 10 degrees. Now this is another profound clue as to, every cathedral, every menhir is inserted into the earth. At Chartres, it goes deep into the ground. In fact, it goes down so that the crypt is the same distance under the floor as the vault is above the floor. The crypt, which has the sacred well in it. Now, let's go on here. On wet, humid days, the heat difference was minimal, perhaps reaching a maximum of 0.3 degrees centigrade. This confirmed Reich's observation that the flickering in the sky was much less clear on wet or humid days. And he realized, and this I've got underlined, that water had a special affinity for orgone, drawing it to itself. Well, here we have another extremely important link in understanding what these ancients were up to and why we find over and over and over and over again in every case the sacred sites, the sacred structures were built on top of or adjacent to water. Springs, wells, flowing water of streams, rivers, and brooks. In 1940, Reich invented a way to concentrate the orgone energy. He constructed an orgone energy accumulator, a box whose walls, floor, and ceiling consisted of several layers of alternating organic and metallic material. And we can go on here. In brief, the boxes, which began as observation chambers, were found to draw in orgone and eventually were labeled orgone accumulators. Experiments proved that the greater the layering of the walls, the greater up to a point the concentration or amount of orgone. In time, accumulators of up to 20 layers were built. Thomas P. Wolfe, MD, after studying and experimenting with orgone accumulators, he says it's the most important single discovery in the history of medicine, bar none. And there's what one looked like. And this shows the structure of it, the alternating. Anybody here ever built one?
I'll show you one right up there.
You know
Over
what,
your head right up there. Let me have it.
Randall, you know what also reminds me of is composting.
Sure. Who does? Oh yeah, okay. Oh, here it is. This is a layered alternating layer. I've never built an accumulator, but we've made orgone blankets. And when my 93-year-old grandmother was dying 10 years ago, on her deathbed, and nothing, no drug, nothing would relieve her pain, I brought her an orgone blanket, and within 5 minutes she was laying under it, she was pain-free.
You made it? Where'd you make it out of?
Yeah, out of
How did you make it?
out of alternating layers of cotton, cloth, and steel wool. Like 6 or 8 layers, I don't remember.
Use screen,
Yeah.
window flash.
Oh, well, I use steel wool. Steel wool is what, like James DeMayo recommends in his orgone accumulator handbook.
But you use steel wool, you use window screen and cotton and layer it out and it'll get to you the same thing.
Cool.
Amjad has something he wants to say.
I know. So I'll wrap it up. This is where we'll pick up in 2 weeks. An ancient science of orgonomy. We'll relook at some of the stuff we've already looked at, plus a lot of new things. Plus we'll examine Wilhelm Reich's weather modification experiments, which are incredible. Yeah.
And how does this tie in with the Grail?
Jed, you want to say something here?
Have you been listening? How does this, she asked the question, how does this tie in with the Grail?
That we're supposed to, so by building the orgone things, then we can...
What I'm doing is I'm presenting the orgone. I'm saying the first thing I said was the work of Wilhelm Reich sheds tremendous light on understanding the ancient science, the ancient lost science. And I've been saying repeatedly, what is the Grail a symbol of? This Grail is a symbol of the ancient lost science. So what we're doing is we're coming at it from several different directions. We're looking at the ancient structures, we're looking at the ancient literature, and we're examining modern work that I think shed light. I brought up the thing about the accumulating subsurface tectonic stress creating ambient electrical field columns, because I believe that's an important modern research that we can use to shed light on the ancient science. I bring in Wilhelm Reich for exactly the same reason. If we think of the Grail as being a method of restoring fecundity to a desolate landscape, see, there's the link. See, that's what I'm trying to say, and I don't want to spell every single thing out for you. I want you to think, I want you to make connections and put 2 and 2 together on your own, because that's how you integrate this as part of your own consciousness and your own experience.
We loved it, Randall.
What?
Very good. We loved it.
Good. Thank you.
Randall,
Or 2 weeks.
Thanks, Verlaine.